Hey, thanks for joining me. I'm Brianna and I want to welcome you to Kids Kingdom Sunday School. I hope you've been having a great week. Whether you know it or not, today is actually a holiday in the Christian church, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So today happens to be Pentecost, and you're going to learn about what is Pentecost, what happened, why do we celebrate it, and just some other cool facts about today. So I'm going to dive right in. Our faith word of the month is love. So throughout this month, we've been talking about love and how our Bible stories reveal God's love, and how do we share love with each other, and how do we share God's love with the world. To go along with that, we have our memory verse. So our memory verse this month comes from the book of Romans. It's chapter 12, verse 10a. And the memory verse says, "Love each other like the members of your family." So like I said, going along with the theme of love, this verse reminds us that we're all connected and we're all considered part of God's family. So I'm going to give a little bit of background on our lesson today. Like I said, we're talking about Pentecost. So Pentecost in many ways is seen as the birthday of the church. This day happened shortly after Jesus left the disciples. So Jesus had risen from the dead on Easter, and then he came and visited the disciples on the mountaintop. And after that, he had to go on his way, and the disciples were on their own again. And if you remember, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the Great Commission. And so the disciples were given a mission to go and spread the word about God and Jesus' story. And they were supposed to build up the church and make new disciples. So they were out there on their own, and I'm sure they were feeling a little bit nervous about this, being out there on their own. But the good news is that Jesus had made a promise to not leave them by themselves. So he promised that he would send someone to help guide them. And you'll find out in our story, God sent his Holy Spirit to help guide the disciples. So Pentecost is all about the Holy Spirit. And you might have heard, we have the Trinity in the Christian faith. So we have God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit is that third part of the Trinity, and that's the entire focus of Pentecost. So the other cool little fact, in case you didn't know, is that the Methodist Church, I'm sure you've seen this on the banners or flags around the church or online, but we have a symbol, and the Methodist symbol is a cross with a flame next to it. And the flame also comes from the story about Pentecost. The story comes from the book of Acts. It's chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And this section is titled, "The Coming of the Holy Spirit." When the day of Pentecost had come, they were all together in one place. And suddenly from heaven there came a sound like the rush of a violent wind, and it filled the entire house where they were sitting. Divided tongues, as of fire, appeared among them, and a tongue rested on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other languages, as the Spirit gave them ability. Now there were devout Jews from every nation under heaven living in Jerusalem. And at this sound the crowd gathered and was bewildered, because each one heard them speaking in the native language of each. Amazed and astonished, they asked, "Are not all these who are speaking Galileans? And how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt and the parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome, both Jews and proselytes, Cretans and Arabs. In our own languages, we hear them speaking about God's deeds of power. All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, "What does this mean?" So that's our Bible story. So let's break it down a little bit. So the first thing is that all the disciples were gathered together, and it was a day of Pentecost, which we've come to know as this story. And basically, it says from heaven, suddenly there's a huge gush of wind. So if you can imagine, maybe like you can think about a stormy day and you remember like how strong the gust of wind was at that time. That's probably what it felt like. They were sitting there and all of a sudden the wind started blowing like crazy. But then the next thing that happened was that there was these little licks of flame that appeared over each of their heads. So if you can imagine, like a little flame hovering over their head, everyone had one of those. And basically that was the visual representation of the Holy Spirit. And then the Holy Spirit descended into everyone and gave them the ability to talk in different languages. So you have a lot of different senses going on. You have the wind and the noise of the wind. You have the flames and the visual sight of the flames on everyone's heads. And then you have the ability to speak different languages. And so what happened is they're in this, very diverse town of Jerusalem, and all these different people who speak different languages, they started noticing what was going on and came over to figure out what was happening. And all of a sudden they could understand in their own language all these things about God's power and his majesty. And so it was an amazing event, and from that point on, the disciples were able to speak with all different types of languages and go into different countries and help explain to people, tell the story about God and share the good news. So we celebrate this because it was the fulfillment of Jesus' promise that, nobody would be left alone. And so the Spirit came to where they were. And that's the good news for us today, because the Holy Spirit is with you always, wherever you are, whoever you are, and no matter where you come from, the Holy Spirit finds you and resides inside of you. And the Holy Spirit is meant to be your guide. Just like it guided the disciples, the Holy Spirit guides each one of us to know what's right from wrong and to help us become more connected in love with our neighbor. So this is a really cool story because it shows how we're all connected together in a community, because God provided the Holy Spirit for each of us to have. I have a couple wonder questions to help us think about what we think happened back then. So the first wonder question is, what do you think the fire over the disciples' heads looked like? And then the second wonder question is, what do you think the wind felt like? The third wonder question is, how does the Holy Spirit give us love? And the last question is, where do you find love in today's story? As a quick reminder, don't forget to pick up your craft packet from the front porch. And you can always go to Facebook or email Sarah if you have any questions or comments. And hopefully you guys come back next week to join us for our next lesson. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time. Bye.